This is the Education Exchange with Paul Peterson. I am the director of the Harvard Program on Education Policy and Governance. Thank you for joining us. As we begin the second quarter of the 21st century, an interesting and notable trend in American education has emerged. School district enrollments have peaked and are expected to fall by 4, 5, or 6 percentage points during the next decade, depending on who you talk to. At the same time, public schools are spending more than ever, the amount nearing $1 trillion nationwide. Where is all the money going? Surprisingly, the money is not being spent on teachers' salaries. In real dollar terms, they have not increased nationwide, and in fact, over the past 3 years, they registered a significant decline. The monies are instead being spent on additional costs of teacher pensions and medical services, hiring new staff, and a few other things. All this information is coming from the Reason Foundation, which has gathered together statistical information released by the U.S. Department of Education in a series of tables and graphs that tell an amazing story that the media and the think tank world has pretty much ignored. So to discuss these findings, I have with me the Reason Foundation's Director of Education Reform, Aaron Smith. He's co-author of this report entitled K-12 Education Spending Spotlight 2025. Aaron, thank you for joining me on the Education Exchange.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, Aaron, congratulations on putting together a most informative report. So let me first of all ask you the big question. Why is spending on U.S. students now reaching nearly $1 trillion a year? Or maybe it surpassed it by 2025.
Well, there are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, it hasn't always been this way. So in the last couple of decades alone, between 2002 and 2023, public school funding grew by nearly 36% per student after adjusting for inflation. So in 2023, the most recent year that federal data are available, we spent over $20,300 per student across states. And of course, that varies across states. States like New York, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire all spend well in excess of $25,000 per student. And in terms of the leader in New York, public school spending is right around $36,000 per student each year. So the question is why? Why have we seen this tremendous growth over the last couple of decades? The short answer is it's not just due to COVID. It's not just due to the $190 billion in stimulus funding that was doled out by the federal government in the last several years. What we've seen are long-term trends, dating back decades, and we can point to, 2 or 3 structural issues within K through 12 education and how dollars are allocated and spent. The first, as you touched upon, is a surge in non-teaching staff. So between 2002 and 2023, public school enrollment went up by about 4%, but non-teaching staff went up by nearly 23%. So this includes more counselors, social workers, instructional aid, speech language pathologists, and so on.
Well, this is a long story you're giving to me. So let me pick it apart for a bit and ask you, well, how about inflation? I mean, isn't this just due to inflation? Everything's gone up in price. So what's so different about this than my grocery bill?
That's a great question. And we've seen rampant inflation in the last few years, especially, right after the pandemic in those first couple of years. So all of these numbers in our report are adjusted for inflation. And so when we say that funding has increased by 36% per student in the last couple of decades, those are after inflation, right? And so we account for that in our study. And, despite that fact, we do see this rampant increase.
So it's not just inflation. This is all adjusted data. This is in real dollars, not an inflation deflate. It is an inflation deflated dollars, but it's not due simply to, you're not taking the the dollars that you see at the grocery store as your price tag, you're looking beneath that to the real in cost.
Absolutely. Our data tool provides both unadjusted and adjusted numbers, but yeah, when we talk about this stuff, we always cite inflation adjusted figures.
Now, the thing about it that amazed me in this particular study is that teacher salaries are not going up. I would have said, oh, okay, so teachers are being paid more. Maybe that's a good thing. But you're telling me that teacher salaries have actually declined.
Yeah, that's correct. So in the last couple of decades, there's been about a 6% decline on average in teacher salaries. And really, you need to break it up between two time periods, before COVID-19 and after. Before COVID, the story was teacher salaries were stagnant. They were pretty much flat. I think they might have fallen on average by 0.6% in the years leading up to COVID. After COVID, when we saw rampant inflation, inflation was at historic levels not seen since the 70s or 80s. Salaries actually went down, so that's why you saw a 6% decline in the last couple of decades. But yeah, the real story there is not necessarily the inflation and what that did to teacher salaries post COVID. It's the fact that they were stagnant before the pandemic, right? They were flat as a pancake, despite the fact that in the years leading up to the pandemic, we saw some tremendous growth in funding, right? So I
Well,
think,
in my classroom, I always say to my students, and now I have to say something different because of your report. I always say, well, teacher salaries are always going to go up because they have to go up. According to the economist Baumol, I call it Baumol theory. According to Baumol theory, I think he was at Princeton. Didn't he become the president at Princeton eventually? According to his theory, the salaries of teachers have to go up to keep pace with salaries in other segments of society as long as we're having an increasingly productive society and everybody's salaries are climbing. So don't teacher salaries have to keep pace with other sectors of society, or else you're going to see a decline in teacher quality?
yeah, I think that's true. And what you described is, an issue that public schools faced in terms of productivity, right? And so, the issue there is, putting that in the context of funding increases. So the dollars have been there to increase teacher salaries and to be competitive with other sectors and to hire high quality teachers. But for various reasons, those dollars, the new dollars that we've seen injected into public education in the last couple of decades have not made their way to teacher salaries. They're going to other things, other priorities.
Well, you could say, okay, they're not getting a salary increase, but they're getting an increase in the value of their benefits because the cost of benefits has been steadily climbing. So maybe it's just that teachers are being compensated in another way. They're not getting a salary increase, but their pension benefits are climbing and their medical services are costing more these days, but they're still getting these high quality medical insurance benefits that teachers have enjoyed for many years.
Yeah, on the surface, I mean that makes complete sense, and that's a good argument. Benefit spending has increased by I think 81% per student after adjusting for inflation. So in 2023, U.S. public schools spent over $4,000 per kid on employee benefits. So that includes healthcare and teacher pensions, with the latter driving most of that increase. But the issue is with this benefit spending increase is that this doesn't necessarily mean that teacher pensions are actually getting any better. So over time, a lot of these dollars have gone to unfunded liabilities. So states have failed to set
Now,
aside.
please tell our listeners what an unfunded liability is. That is a concept that that needs a little explaining.
Yeah, it's basically debt, right? So state legislators have promised certain benefits to teachers, and they have failed to save enough money to cover those benefits. So it's basically the difference between what you've promised and the value of those benefits and how much you have in the bank, so to speak, to pay for them. And as of, I think, last year, total unfunded liabilities or total debt for teacher pensions was about $400 billion across states. And so this means that when teachers nowadays pay into pension plans, they're not just paying for their future benefits, right? They're actually paying for teachers who have already retired. So this means that costs are going up. They're paying more into it. School districts and teachers are paying more into it. But that's not due to benefits getting any better.
So today's teachers are paying for the pensions of teachers who taught 20 years ago.
That's right, because states have failed to put aside enough funding to cover those
So those
promises.
teachers should have been paying more into their benefit plan back then.
Yeah, and for various reasons, they did not. It was easier to kick the can down the road and make some lofty assumptions about what their investment returns would be. And here we are today with some big eye-popping pension debt figures.
So you're saying that although there more money is going for benefits, today's teachers are not benefiting from these increases in pension benefit contributions. So, but there's another problem with pensions that's always bothered me, and I'd love to have your view on it, and that is most of the pensions go to people who stay in education for, throughout their lifetime, whereas and there are a lot of them who go into teaching for 5 years and then they go on to do something else instead. Maybe they become a mother, or maybe they become a father, or maybe
Yeah.
they decide they want to do something else with their life. So they get nothing because you have to be vested, and vesting usually takes 5 years. So am I right in saying this?
Yeah, you're right. It's a very good deal if you stay on enough years and you retire as a teacher. So then you're fully vested and your benefits are tremendous. But as you laid out, if you're less experienced and you quit teaching early, or even if you move across state lines where benefits aren't portable, that's a problem. You're not getting the full value of those benefits and what you actually paid in. You would have been better off paying into a 401k and saving yourself. And so that's a big issue. And so on the one hand, teachers who stay in the classroom for a long time can really benefit from those plans, but the vast majority who teach and don't retire as teachers are certainly shortchanged.
So you also mentioned right at the beginning, and I have not explored that. So let's return to that topic, which is the school districts are hiring a lot more people other than teachers.
Yeah.
So as student enrollment is staying flat or growing very slowly, a lot of personnel are being added to the school district, but they're not teachers. So what's happening here?
Yeah, so we've seen some pretty big increases in non-teaching staff, and I think a lot of people might look at this and just dismiss it as we're hiring a lot of administrators, and that's actually true. We are seeing some pretty large increases in administrators, but in terms of the raw numbers, right? This is where it really gets interesting. You drill down into where are all these non-teaching staff coming from? And the two categories that stand out are first, instructional aides. People who work inside of classrooms and assist teachers. And then student support staff, which is a pretty broad category that includes things like psychologists, social workers, audiologist and many other positions. And so in terms of raw numbers, that's driving it. But then after that, so the third biggest category of growth is administrative support staff. So HR, finance, test coordinators, and so on and so forth. So
I often wonder about lunchroom workers and crossing guards, bus drivers, the more, ordinary folks. Is that a growing category too, or is that not where the growth is?
So that's not where the big numbers are. So I think for the most part, the way NCES, parses out their data, a lot of those staffing positions are lumped together, so it's hard to see to get drill down to the nuances. But only a handful of positions, librarians being one of them, have actually seen declines over the years.
Well, I was going to bring that up, and now
Yeah.
that you brought it up, we got to make a little detour here. Why are we having fewer librarians? There's the reading problem is the big problem in the United States. So I suppose the best way to solve the reading problem is to have students read. Well,
That
uh,
would be an assumption. The cynic in me might say kids are reading fewer books, which is probably true, and also, schools are relying more on tablets and technology for reading as opposed to physical books, which, in my view, is a problem for a number of reasons. And it might also be that they're relying less on actual librarians who are certified and to be librarians and paying lower cost staff to man those positions. It's hard to tell from the data, but that seems to be the trend.
I can think of librarians I learned a lot more from than from any teacher. They have their ability to find things is just truly amazing if they're a good librarian. But so
Right.
I found that a disappointing fact that you shared with us all. But maybe we're getting some benefits from the personnel that are being hired. Maybe the real problem in American education is not academics, but it's sort of social and emotional growth. And we need more social workers, we need more counselors, we need more guidance for students about the other aspects of their life than just academic learning.
Yeah, and I hear that argument all the time, and there's elements of truth in it, right? So kids are difficult to serve, and they might have a lot of needs. I think my general pushback is that public schools need to get better at their mission, what they're supposed to be doing, teaching kids how to read, do math, how to write, civics, those sorts of things, and if public schools aren't doing those jobs effectively, then it makes little sense to ask more of them, right? So we've seen a classic example of mission creep in terms of the responsibilities that public schools have undertaken. So I think that's the main pushback, and some folks might cite some research showing some positive effects of non-teaching staff like instructional aides. There's a few reports showing that teaching aides and other staffing positions could have good effects for kids. Generally, my pushback there is that those effect sizes are pretty tiny and minuscule, especially in comparison to the investments that we've made in those positions. And it's hard to justify the investments in non-teaching staff based upon that research and the sort of the small effect sizes we've seen from those studies.
Well, where does the demand for more teaching aides come from? Is it that teachers want somebody to help them with the minor league parts of their job, the fact they've got to fill out more forms than ever before, or they have to deal with more specific issues than ever before? Is that why we're getting more teacher aides? What's the
That's
explanation for that?
That's a great question. I don't have a concrete answer based on the data, but you can think of a couple reasons. One might be, and sort of the optimist in me might say, well, they're low cost positions, and public schools are using them in an innovative way to assist teachers with certain low level tasks that helps them to take things off their plates and assist with students. And then another reason might be, special education. So we know a lot of these staff that have been hired have responsibilities related to special education. And while we don't have great data, some of the figures that I've seen would suggest that a good chunk of these instructional aides were hired to assist students with disabilities.
Well, so if the paraprofessionals or teacher aides or whatever you want to call this category, if they're really beneficial, we should see the results in the learning that's taking place in the classroom. But what we have seen is that, learning, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, actually was flat. for ever since about 2013, and then took a tumble during COVID. Well, the tumble may be explainable, but it was flat to declining even before that. And all this growth was occurring throughout this entire 21st century. So there doesn't seem to be much of a payoff from this additional personnel.
No, not at all. And that's my perspective. And you see states like New York that have invested heavily in public schools. New York specifically, their public school funding has grown by about 76% per student over the years after adjusting for inflation, and their scores have been relatively flat, right? And then you look at a state like Mississippi, where spending is low, and they've had relatively modest growth in spending, and their returns have been pretty good in both reading and math. And so yeah, there doesn't seem to be much of a payoff. I think the counterpoint there, a lot of folks will say, well, there's research showing that that funding will help improve outcomes, and it has positive effects, but we haven't actually seen this turn into results, right? There's nothing tangible in terms of, at least in terms of test scores, showing that results have improved as a result of funding.
Well, graduation rates have gone up. I mean, high school graduation rates is the one bright spot in all of this. So what's your explanation for the increasing percentage of students who are graduating from high school?
I don't know if that's worth the paper that it's written on. So as we know, like you can lower standards, you could, push kids into credit recovery classes that aren't rigorous. So there are ways to rig, and I don't mean to be cynical, but they're easy to manipulate, right? So if you lower standards and push kids along, sure, those graduation rates are higher, but I'm not sure that actually means anything.
Now, there's a lot of variation across the country. That's one of the themes of your report. One of the interesting things is you can just see how every state is doing this, and listeners will want to just sort of dig in and take a look at what's happening in their state, because you can see exactly what's happening in each and every state in all of these domains. So, what's your takeaway on the variation in expenditures and salaries and so forth? Do we learn anything from looking at how different states handle this issue?
Well, we know consistently across states there are structural problems, like we've discussed in K through 12 education. Staffing not focusing on academics, teacher pension debt, and another one would be declining student enrollment, and what that means for efficiency and whether public schools need to close. So there's definitely commonalities across states, although the magnitude of those commonalities certainly varies. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The big takeaway is that even in states that aren't spending as much, or where spending isn't growing as much, a lot of the times, those, they're seeing good returns on their money. And states like New York and others that have seen rampant growth in public school funding aren't getting good ROI on their dollars. And so that's a big takeaway. But the main thing here is that, public schools have structural problems with how they spend dollars, and policymakers need to pay attention to those issues.
Well, New York is an interesting case in point. I mean, here it is. The media is all concentrated in New York City. That's an exaggeration, of course, but there's a huge concentration of media resources in that state. And that's the state that the greatest increase over time in per pupil expenditures. There's also seeing declining enrollments. I mean, New York is sort of a classic case in point, but the media are paying almost no attention to what's going on. At least that's the way I read it. Maybe I'm wrong, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, and I've asked this question many times, and I haven't really gotten a good response. Is like, if according to all this research, funding should result in better outcomes. So why haven't we seen that in New York? And the general response is, well, just imagine how bad outcomes would be if they didn't spend that much money, which to me is a very unsatisfying answer. But I'll point out too is that not only are funding levels, reaching absurdity in New York. But there are still folks out there who are calling for more dollars in New York. There's a paper published, I think, back in August by Bruce Baker of the University of Miami that made the argument that public schools in New York don't have enough money, and we need to give them more. On the face of it, I think that's ridiculous.
Well, one of the things that is likely to happen going forward is that the federal government is going to be pulling back. I don't know how much it's going to pull back, but we do know that it expanded its contributions to K-12 education enormously over the period since COVID broke out, and that the Trump administration wants to turn that around. So, are we going to see an apparent crisis in the funding of American education induced by federal policy?
I don't think so. I think it's just basically going to return to the mean in terms of where things were before the pandemic. If you wanted to cut federal education spending, you need to go after some of the big grants like Title I, and that's politically that's not feasible. That's not going to happen, and so I think the best that the Trump administration can do is curtail spending growth and cut around the edges. But in terms of big, deep, meaningful cuts to federal funding, I just don't see that happening.
How about special education? The percentage of students in special education has now increased to 15% of all students. Originally, they thought it should be 4%. It soon jumped to 8%. Now it's doubled again. So is this an area that's where growth is just, I don't know, maybe there are more kids who need it today, but I just don't know what's driving this growth. What's your assessment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for special education, when you look at the overall data, the overall picture, I want to say it's a 2 percentage point growth in students with disabilities, over the last couple of decades or so, which on the surface doesn't look like a lot, but when you dig into the specific categories, and I don't have the data in front of me, but I think the two categories that stand out in terms of seeing big increases would be autism and I think other disabilities, which is a pretty broad category that includes ADHD. So it's not all categories that are increasing, and overall you see a relatively modest growth, if you can call 2 percentage points modest. But when you dig into specific categories, that's where you sort of see what's happening, and that tells a different story.
But that's not the explanation for the major change. You wouldn't say this is a special education story.
In terms of spending,
Yes.
it's a part of the story for sure. How much of the story is remains a question. It's certainly not anywhere close to being the entire story. But due to just data limitations, the fact that we don't know a lot about sped costs, the federal government doesn't report good longitudinal data about what's being spent on public education. We're limited in terms of how much we know and how much we can say actually contributes to overall K-12 spending.
So now there's one last question I want to pose, and that is about the teacher unions. The teacher unions have always said that the main reason they're needed is to protect teachers from salary cuts and to make sure that they're adequately compensated. And teacher unions are a major part of our governance system today. We have collective bargaining, I think, in 30 some states. So over 35 states have a state rule that says you must have collective bargaining in your state with respect to teachers. So, why haven't unions protected teachers' salaries when the money is there? The money is there, and the teacher's job, or the union's job, is to protect teacher salaries. Why haven't the teacher unions forced the school districts to compensate teachers at a higher level?
Yeah, you're right. The money is there. One reason I can think of is that they have a strong incentive not to, and that incentive is the more staff that public schools hire, the more people paying into their coffers. So the more people paying membership dues. So unions have a strong incentive to encourage school districts and to support them in their endeavor to hire more staff. So sometimes that incentive works against teacher salaries.
But another explanation is that teacher unions are paper tigers, that they really don't, they talk a lot, but they really don't have the capacity to force school districts to focus their money on the salary schedule.
Yeah, there might be truth to that, although we see in states with stronger unions like Massachusetts and New York and Washington, we've seen salaries climb higher there. Although the one big caveat to note is that even in those states that have experienced the highest growth in teacher salaries, it doesn't match what the states have invested. So funding growth has still far exceeded teacher salary growth, even in states with higher growth in teacher salaries.
Well, this is a fascinating study, Aaron, and there's a lot of questions that emerge from it. I think there's more questions that come up than we have answered, maybe partly because it's so hard to get high quality data from the U.S. Department of Education and from school districts. But you have done the best possible, so congratulations to you on an excellent report.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So thank you for joining me on the Education Exchange. I have been speaking with Aaron Smith. He's the Director of Education Reform at the Reason Foundation and co-author of a new foundation report entitled K-12 Education Spending Spotlight 2025. I am Paul Peterson. This is the Education Exchange. Please join me every Monday at noon when our weekly podcast is released on the Education Next website.